Friends, good evening to you, and a blessed Lent. I'm very happy to welcome you to this series on Thérèse of Child Jesus, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. We've titled the series "The Little Way of the Little Flower." Before I begin, I have two caveats. One of them is my own personal limitation on this matter and on this topic. Once again, I have to admit, I'm not a Carmelite. I have not studied Therese all my life. Certainly, I'm not a Carmelite nun, as you can see. But there are reasons why I chose to reflect with her this Lent. And I'll come to that in a little bit. I just want to express my limitation in the sense that this is my understanding of Therese of Lisieux. It's not an academic work at all. This is more spirituality and prayer, trying to imitate a woman who merely lived 24 years and yet her life was miraculous, in the most simple and in the most little way. So keep that at the back of your mind. Those of you who might be experts on Thérèse of Lisieux and perhaps have read more, studied more, I'm sure they will be much lacking in my presentation. Secondly, the limitations of a 6-week series, really, as I got into trying to understand and get as much as I can from my readings, even though it's the little way, there simply is so much written about her. Besides her autobiography, which is from where bulk of the information that I have, I'm going to present to you. But there's so much that's written about her. There's this tremendous amount of analysis and even psychoanalysis of trying to understand this woman, and I'm not touching any of that. Because it simply is too much to deal with. I will stick to the main themes and just make sure that we can learn from this woman important things for our own spiritual growth. So that's my focus here. So why Thérèse of Lisieux? Why this woman? Why did I choose to reflect on her? First of all, I must touch on what I did with John of the Cross in the fall. Many people found John of the Cross too heavy. In fact, some people gave up along the way because it was simply too deep. And it was very demanding for many. Now, Therese's way is called the little way. So I wanted to offer a contrast to John of the Cross. Something simpler, something that people will find accessible, something people can say, okay, this I can handle. Hence, Thérèse of Lisieux. So I wanted to offer a different alternative for Christian spirituality. Now, historically, Therese comes almost 3 centuries after John of the Cross. Now, remember, the reason I'm connecting Therese and John of the Cross is because they're both Carmelites, and they're both discalced Carmelites. Along with Therese of Avila, John of the Cross got involved in reforming the Carmelites and founded the discalced Carmelites. Therese is a discalced Carmelite nun who comes 3 centuries after John of the Cross and Therese of Avila. Therese of Avila and John of the Cross were in Spain, but the two of the nuns came to France, to Lisieux, and founded the Carmel convent. In fact, when Therese joined, one of the original founders of that convent was still alive. So then, this is the reason I'm connecting John of the Cross and Therese. So, Therese knew about the writings of John of the Cross, and sometimes found answers for herself in John, but then she also mentions that she found complex authors difficult to navigate. So, if you had trouble understanding John of the Cross, remember, you're not alone, I'm not alone. Therese, another great saint, found his writings complex. She found John a little difficult for her. Instead, she offers a way that many of us can find more accessible. Hence, Thérèse of Lisieux. And then, of course, in the fall, I dealt with a man religious, John of the Cross, and during Lent, I wanted to deal with a woman religious, Therese of. Now, you might ask me, why not Therese of Avila? Because then that would be more of John of the Cross. I did not want to go into the mystical theology part and deal with Therese, who is hardly described as a mystic. Her way is completely and creatively different than Therese of Avila and John of the Cross. But there are things in common between John of the Cross and Therese. One is that they both had a life-changing experience. For John of the Cross, it was the 9 months that he spent in prison, but which also was a moment of great illumination deep within. Now for Therese, her conversion experience, and she calls it a conversion experience, happened when she was very young. She was 9 years old, and it happened on a Christmas night when they had just come back from the Christmas Mass. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So in both of them, there is this deep experience that becomes transformative. Now, the commonality between the two of them is that the love that they sought and discovered are the same. They approached the same love from two completely different angles. So if you did complete the John of the Cross session with me, then, and if you complete Thérèse of Lisieux with me, you'll find that they are both heading in the same direction, but from completely different angles. They were both intense about love. They both wrote immensely. We know about the poems of John of the Cross. Therese herself wrote 54 poems, and we'll try and read and discover some of them, although my focus is not on her writings, on her poems. I'm really going to talk about her spirituality. But she wrote 54 of these poems. And we come to know about both of them through their own writings. So Therese writes her autobiography. It's called The Story of the Soul, and I'll refer to that in a little bit. So we come to know about both of them through their writings. Both of them were absorbed in Scripture. You know that John of the Cross, his entire writings, his prose about the poems that he wrote were punctuated by Scripture, and you find that in Therese of Lisieux as well. So in that sense, I'm starting where I left off with John of the Cross, but from a completely different angle. Now, since many of you traveled the road with John of the Cross that I offered last fall, I have to also make some other comparisons and contrasts. One is that John of the Cross was born in poverty. Remember, his childhood was spent in poverty. That is not the case with Thérèse of Lisieux. She was from a bourgeois family in France, very comfortable, very loved, and so that is a great contrast between the two of them. Now we see how Therese struggles with scruples, and she struggled with spiritual aridity a lot, and the dark night that John of the Cross refers to. Now, John of the Cross would be helping, in his lifetime, nuns like Thérèse of Lisieux, who was struggling. In fact, all his writings were kind of meant for spiritual direction. His own experience, he would put it down so that other people may gain from it. Therese lacked consolation in prayer, like John of the Cross did. Both John and Therese experienced the dark night, and yet were totally consumed in love. And this I find very, very fascinating, that even though they struggle with this spiritual dryness, their expression of their love is that much more intense. So it seems to me that there is a connection between the two. Therese and John approach spirituality from two different angles. One we associate with mystical theology, and the other with just childlike trust and confidence in God. Very different than what we would call mysticism. In fact, some even claim that Therese developed a mistrust of mysticism and then replaced it with what we can call the little way, not the complex way, not the big grandiose way, but the little way. It was a way of complete abandonment to God's love. So with that bit of introduction, I want to move on to her life, but before I tell you about her birth, I want to talk about the sources of information that we have about her. So first of all, we have her autobiography. It's called The Story of a Soul, and it's written by her. And it is not really an act of self-description. She's telling a story as an act of obedience. And what do I mean by that? She did not undertake the writing of a biography on her own. She did that at the request of some people. So really, the story of the soul comes to us in three manuscripts. Manuscript A, Manuscript B, and Manuscript C. And they came about in different ways, each one of them. So Manuscript A, in her autobiography, comes about when her two sisters, Pauline and Marie, these two people were her blood sisters, who were also in the same convent. And the three sisters, Pauline and Marie and Therese, were sitting and talking, and Therese began to narrate several incidents from her childhood. So her sister Marie said how good it would be if Therese could just write these things down. And Pauline agreed. And at that time, Pauline was the prioress of the convent. So she had some authority over Therese. And so she says to her, I'm not asking you, I'm ordering you to write. So Therese, as an act of obedience, wrote Manuscript A, and it was given to Pauline on the 20th of January, 1896. Much of it is about her childhood. Now, Manuscript B was addressed to another sister, Marie, who was also in the same convent. Marie asked Therese if she could write and describe her little way. Now, at this point, Therese was already ill and very close to death. So a few months later, Therese confided in her sister Marie that she would die. She had a premonition that she would pass away. So then Marie asked Therese to write about what she calls the secrets of Jesus. This is what we now know as the manuscript that tells us much about the little way. So Manuscript B contains Therese's essential doctrine. And then there is Manuscript C, which is addressed to another sister who was not a blood sister of Therese, Mother Marie de Gonzague. And she was the prioress. She was the prioress for the longest time that Therese was in the convent. Now, Pauline, the older sister, when she read Manuscript A, she realized that Therese had written a lot about her childhood and the entrance to the convent, but did not write much about religious life itself. And so one day Pauline goes to the prioress, Mother Marie de Gonzague, and asks her if she would request Therese to write about her life in the convent. She was barely there for 9 years. Now, the excuse that Pauline gave to the prioress was that Therese is reaching her end, and we need some information for her eulogy. So if Therese would write it down, it would be easier for the nuns then to deliver the eulogy. And so there are 2 lengthy chapters that Therese writes about her experience in the convent. So these 3 manuscripts really become for us the source of the information that we have and the 6 weeks that we are going to complete. So she was born, Therese was born on 2nd of January, 1873, and she died in 1897, just 24 years. She lived for 24 years. And she was born to Louis Martin and Marie Azélie Guérin. She was affectionately called Zélie. Louis Martin was a jeweler and a watchmaker, and they were very devout parents. By the way, Louis Martin and Zélie are the only couple that are canonized. So Therese's parents have been canonized. And actually it happened as recently as Pope Francis's papacy. So in many sense, she's a very contemporary saint. So they had both made an effort to enter into religious life independently. But for various reasons, they could not proceed. So then Zélie, Therese's mother, becomes a lace maker, and she was so good at it that she set up her own business at a very, very young age. Now, Louis and Zélie met in 1858, and they got married the same year. Initially, even though they got married, they lived like brother and sister for 10 months. Remember, they both wanted to be religious, join congregations, and did not happen. So for some reason, even after they got married, they decided to live as brother and sister. And of course, then a confessor is the one who helped them to embrace married life to its fullness. And boy, did they. They had 9 children. 4 of them did not survive. 5 of them survived, and they all became nuns. 4 of them were nuns in that same Carmel convent along with Therese, and Therese was the youngest. And then there's one sister, Leonie, who became a nun in a different congregation. So they had 5 surviving children. There was Marie, who's the oldest, and there's Pauline, and there's Leonie, and there's Celine, and of course there is Therese. Now, after Therese was born, her life took a very fragile turn, and so she had to be turned over to a wet nurse. And for 15 months, Therese was looked after by a nurse. Now, this nurse had already taken care of 2 other children of the family. Now, because this nurse had her own children, she had 2 other children, it's not that Therese was taken care of at home by the nurse, but actually the nurse took Therese to her home and took care of her along with her other 2 children. When she was 15 months old, Therese returned to Alençon, which is where she was born. And her family surrounded her with great affection. This girl, and all the girls for that matter, were raised in a very loving and Catholic family, quintessentially Catholic. You might as well call their home a little convent. As I said, they were all very loved. Louis gave very touching and naive, touching and pet names to his daughters. Marie was called his diamond. Pauline was called his noble pearl. Celine was called the bold one. But Therese was called his little queen. And in fact, Therese often calls her father my little king, my king, in her writings. Therese was educated in a very, very Catholic environment. Now, they had Mass every day at 5:30. They would go for Mass. There was strict observance of fasts, prayer, and they followed the liturgical year and the feasts, right? All that. They practiced charity. There are numerous instances of the family going out of their way to do charity. And Therese herself was a very, very, very charitable woman. But she grew up in this context. In fact, they were so charitable that occasionally they would invite a homeless person or a stranger for a meal at home with them. She was a very nervous child, very good, very intelligent, remembered everything, as her autobiography tells her. When she was only 4.5 years old, her mother died. And she died from a tumor, which probably today we would call cancer. And she died at the age of 45. And this had a tremendous impact on Therese's life. Remember, she was the youngest. And it has a tremendous impact on her life. It was a severe blow. And in fact, as she writes it, she would say that that was the day in the first part of her life that her life stopped. 3 months after Zélie died, Louis just took his family and moved to Alençon, where he spent the rest of his life with Zélie's brother, who was a pharmacist. And so that's where they lived in Buissonnet. Buissonnet is the town where they moved to. Les Buissonnets. So from Alençon, they've moved to Les Buissonnets, and the convent is in. So looking back, Therese would say that the move to Les Buissonnets is the beginning of the second part of her life. So she lived here from 4.5 years old all the way up to 14, the time in which she enters the convent after many struggles. So Pauline, her older sister, took on the role of a mother in Therese's life. And she took this role very seriously. In fact, she did not make Therese feel the absence of her mother. So between the father and Pauline, she was very well taken care of. What kind of a little girl was she? And it is important for us to know that how she describes herself. She says, when she was later writing at the age of 22, when she's writing her autobiography, she says that I was far from being a perfect girl. Her mother wrote about her that she would be somebody who would throw tantrums. And sometimes she would roll on the floor in desperation. And her mother would say that even in her sleep, she was a disturbed little girl. She did not sleep in peace. Her mother would call her a nervous child. Now, whether all of this contributed to the kind of spirituality that she has, it's something that we can only speculate about. Much has been written about all of this, but as I said, I'm not focusing much on any of that. Now, Therese herself accuses herself of self-love. She calls herself that she had excessive self-love as a kid. And she gives us a story. One time her mother said to her that she would give her a sou. A sou is a French monetary denomination. It's 1/10 of a French franc. It was a big deal for kids in those days. And her mother told her that she would give her a sou if she kissed the ground. And Therese writes about it. She says, my pride revolted at the thought of kissing the ground. And she told her mother, oh no, little mother, I would prefer not to have the sou. And then, of course, Therese says it's because of her self-love that she showed this kind of demeanor. Another time, they were visiting a family friend, and her mother asked Marie to dress Therese in a sky blue frock and not to let her arms bare so that she would not get sunburned. Of course, Therese had her own will. She thought she would look prettier, bare arms, and chose to dress in defiance of her mother's wish. Now, this is all Therese's words. This is how she's analyzing herself. And she saw early in her life her inclination towards self-love. As she says, with a nature such as my own, Had I been raised by parents without virtue, or even if I had been spoiled by the maid, I would have become very bad and perhaps even been lost. So she saw in herself a capacity to stray. The other quality that we notice about Therese, and now this would definitely have an impact on her spirituality, and I'm calling her all or nothing mentality, all or nothing. So one time her sister Leonie, she was old enough now, and she old enough to give up playing with dolls, and she brought a basket filled with doll making and doll dressing paraphernalia, and offered them to Celine and to Therese. Now Celine was very modest. She took a ball of wool that was in the basket. Therese, on the other hand, she said, "I choose it all." And so she took the entire basket, not just something from the basket. At the time, Therese described it as an act of selfishness. But later in life, this would turn out to be her virtue. So when it comes to love, it was all or nothing. More so when it comes to suffering, and we will talk about suffering in this very brief life. And she'll say, if I want to suffer, I want it all or nothing. So this character trait of hers had a great impact on her spirituality. Therese even describes herself as a 4-year-old rascal. So that's a little insight into her life, her childhood life. As far as education is concerned, she was homeschooled till she was 8.5, and then she entered school kept by the Benedictine nuns in Lisieux. But she had to go to school and come back in the evening, and it was not a good experience for her. In fact, she calls it a traumatic experience for her, not because of her education, but she was intelligent. She was not good at writing or arithmetic. Having said that, she writes her own autobiography, which takes the world by storm. But she was not good at writing or arithmetic. But she was bullied at her school by a girl of 14, who herself did not do very well at school. Therese did very well at school. And then she showed a disinclination for boisterous games and recreation. She preferred to tell stories. She would spend time taking care of the littler children. But she always looked forward to coming back in the evening at home and being with her father and with Celine, her sister. So even though she did not enjoy her school too much, she learned much but suffered quite a bit. She would end up crying by herself because she was so tormented by whatever experiences she had, particularly the bullying. Now, when she was 9 years old, Pauline, who was her mother, enters the Carmel convent. And this devastated Therese, because Therese knew that the Carmel convent was a cloister and that Pauline was not coming back home ever again. The family would visit her, but she would not come back. So the shock of Pauline leaving caused her great trauma. In fact, as much trauma as the death of her mother. At this time, she got very seriously ill. And I'm mentioning this illness at this point because it's finally a serious illness that kills Therese. Now, there is an unexplained incident when one time she went for a walk with her uncle. And right there, she began to tremble severely. The family thought that perhaps she was still just cold, and the family covered her with blankets, but the tremors continued. She was so cold that she had to clench her teeth and she just could not talk. There has been really no diagnosis of of what really happened. One doctor seems to think that Therese reacts to emotional frustration with a neurotic attack. And you know that she'd had quite a bit of emotional frustration with her mom passing away, with the experience of being bullied at school, and then of course her sister, who was her second mother, joining the convent. So Pauline, who was by now in the convent, began to write to her to get her out of this frustration that she was going through, this trauma that she was going through. But then she ends up having a very beautiful experience. Therese had recovered from these tremors, and one day she was in Marie's room. Marie was her other sister, and she had joined the convent as well. And there was a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Marie's room. And she reported, this is on May 13th, 1883, that she saw the Virgin smile at her. And this eased her illness. In fact, this kind of illness doesn't happen again. And she feels that it's the Virgin that was, Virgin Mary, that was instrumental in her healing. Now she shares this with the people in the convent, at the Carmelite convent. Especially, I'm sure the family went to visit them, she would share, and she found herself being questioned about the event to the extent that Therese really begins to doubt her own experience. In fact, she began to think that the illness was artificially caused by her. So this kind of trauma is kind of part of her life. Her mother had said that she was a very nervous child, and of course you see that constantly in her life. And so she writes at one point in autobiography, "I thought that my sickness was deliberate, and this was real martyrdom for my soul." Now the word martyrdom, I'm using it very deliberately because Therese would have loved to be a martyr. She should have lovingly accepted that role. She did not. But then she calls this a martyrdom for her soul. In October 1886, her older sister Marie entered the Carmelite convent monastery, and this added to Therese's grief. So now it was only Celine and Therese and her father, and of course her uncle and their family. Now, at the age of 13, now remember, she's this very, very sensitive, nervous, traumatized child. But then at the age of 13, she has what she calls an experience of complete conversion. Now, may I remind you that even as Therese is going through all this, she still is in a very loving home. Her family is still that religious, Catholic, faithful family. None of that has changed, right? Her father adored her, and she adored her father. If you read her autobiography, this relationship between this father and daughter is truly, truly spectacular. I think of Pope Francis dedicating this year to St. Joseph. I think there's a tremendous amount to be said about the role of fathers in the lives of their children. We think a lot about that with mothers, particularly with Mary. But there is much to be said about that. In any case, the experience is that, like it was the tradition in French culture, that Christmas Eve, before they went for Mass, children would leave their shoes at the fireplace. And so Therese left her shoes, and then when they came back that night, Louis and his daughters Leonie, Celine, and Therese, they were tired and there was very little energy left. And Therese had left her shoes on the hearth, expecting gifts, and in those days not by Santa Claus but really by child Jesus, who is imagined to have traveled through the air, bearing toys and cakes, just like today children believe that Santa Claus comes through the chimney and leaves gifts there. So they thought that the child Jesus did that. Now, as they came into the house after Mass, Celine, her sister, and her were going up the stairs to change. But for whatever reason, Louis Martin was not in a very good mood that day, perhaps exhausted by the fact that it was early in the morning, late night, early morning, and her daughter was always perhaps weepy, perhaps tired, perhaps frustrated and irritated. And so as they were going up, Louis says, "Therese is far too old for this now. Fortunately, this will be the last year." And as sensitive as Therese was, she had begun to cry. And Celine told her not to go down back immediately. But then Therese, she pulls herself up together, wipes her tears, she ran down the stairs, knelt by the fireplace, unwrapped the gifts that were in the shoes, and she was jubilant as ever. So here is how she describes this conversion experience. So this is critical for her. She is moving from being a child to a grown-up. So she says, "In an instant, Jesus, content with my goodwill, accomplished the work I had not been able to do in 10 years. After 9 sad years, she says, she recovered the strength of soul she had lost." And I'm sure she's referring to the loss of her mother, and then to Pauline leaving and to Marie leaving, right? So she becomes this very nervous child. But she says that at this point, on that Christmas night, she recovered the strength of the soul that she had lost. And she said, "Then I will retain it forever." She discovered joy in not being pampered, in not being treated like a child. And she says, "In a word, I felt charity enter my heart, the need to forget myself to make others happy. Since this blessed night, I was not defeated in any battle, but instead I went from victory to victory and began, so to speak, to run a giant's course." So she considers this her growing up experience, but more than anything else, the conversion is the need to forget myself to make others happy. Now, this will become critical to her little way, to her spirituality, and hence the emphasis that I have laid on this experience. After the experience of conversion, it was time for her first Holy Communion, and Therese was about 10 years old when she made her communion, and it was a marvelous experience for her. But it is around this time also that Therese says that she got an inclination that suffering awaited her. She had great premonition about her life, and also premonition close to her dying. She just had that blessing. She just had that gift. The day after her communion, she says, "I felt born within my heart a great desire to suffer, and at the same time, the interior assurance that Jesus reserved a great number of crosses for me." Now, why she had that experience when she was only 10, it's hard to explain. But as she writes about her life when she was about 22, 23, this is what she says, that right after her communion, there was born in her heart a desire to suffer. And at the same time, the interior assurance that Jesus reserved a great number of crosses for me. At some point, I will share it. I think it's the second last session I talk about suffering in her life. the question that she asks is, do I suffer well? Do I suffer well? Now, when she was 14, she experienced a tremendous amount of calm in her life. And she began to read Thomas A. Kempis's Imitation of Christ. Now, this book, The Imitation of Christ, along with the Bible, became the two most important books in her life. In fact, she relied on it till the end. These two books became her source of spiritual strength. And you think of that she lived in a congregation that had great masters like Therese of Avila and John of the Cross, but that's not where she found her strength. It was the Imitation of Christ and the Bible. So when she's 14, then her father now is about 63, and she tells her father that she would like to enter the Carmel convent. But she was too young. She was only 14. She had to be at least 15. Her father really broke down and cried when he heard this. But then there is a beautiful event associated with her sharing the story, which has something to do with her name as the little flower. So they were sitting outside, and when Therese told her father that, he cried, but then he got up and he picked up a little white flower. And when he picked the flower came with the root. And her father gave this flower with the root to her, explaining the care with which God brought that little flower and preserved it until that day. And Therese later wrote, while I listened, I believed I was hearing my own story. To Therese, the flower seemed a symbol of herself, destined to live in another soil. In other words, from the soil of her home to the soil of the convent. And you know what she does with that flower? That flower, including the root, she actually put it in her book, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas Kempis. And the chapter in which she had kept that book was dedicated to love. And so love will become her little way. Now, she expressed her desire to join the convent, but it didn't come to fruition because she did not get the permission. The priest superior of the monastery would not allow her to join the convent because she was young. And she was bummed. Meanwhile, her father and the family took a trip to Rome. And this was for the 25th anniversary of Pope Leo XIII. And so they had a general audience with the Pope. And there is a tremendous amount of humor here. When they went there, they had a audience with the Pope, and Therese began to talk to Leo XIII about her desire to join the convent, and that she was very young. And Leo told her, if it's meant to happen, God will make it happen. She would not let go. In fact, she was so insistent that she had to be literally picked up and removed from the Pope's presence. She was, if you want to put it in blunt language, she was thrown out of the Pope's presence because she was insistent that she needed to join the convent, and she was trying to get the Pope's permission to do so. Now, while in Rome, you can go to Rome and build your faith or lose your faith. She saw many priests, and she was not impressed. And so she takes upon herself all her life, from that day on, she takes upon herself to pray for priests. Because, as she would say, if the holy priests, the salt of the earth, as Jesus calls them in the gospel, have to be prayed for, what about the lukewarm? Again, she says, if the salt lose its taste, wherewith shall it be salted? And she says, I understood my vocation in Italy, and her vocation was to pray for priests. She took it very, very, very seriously. In any case, on April the 9th, 1888, she entered the convent, and she joined her sisters Marie and Pauline on April the 9th, 1888. So 2 nuns were already in the convent. Celine would join later. So there would be 4 of them in the... I have a couple of pictures that I think I would show you at this point. So that is Louis and Zélie with Therese in the middle, right? This is Therese as a young woman. I think she was 14. This is before she joined the convent. This is the house where they lived in Les Buissonnets after they left Alençon and they came to. And this is, so if you see that, that's a pretty big house. Huh? So they were not poor by any means. This is when she joined the novitiate. She enters the convent. That's the story where we are at the moment. So let's keep that picture there as we. So this is she's about 15 at this point. When she joined Carmel, there were 26 nuns there. Now her life in the convent again was a struggle, in the sense that she was very young. She felt tremendous amount of peace as she entered the convent, but then this was also what she would call a desert experience for her. She struggled because, again, she was sometimes not treated well by other sisters in the convent. She would be. There are times when people would, I want to say, very close to being kind of bullied again. But I've lived in the seminary, and I've experienced a bit of that myself. You have people of various ages from various backgrounds, and sometimes not everybody treats you right. So I can understand that she would be, because she was so young, that she could have fallen into some of that. She then, after a postulancy, she joins the novitiate, and she took her habit in January the 10th, 1889, after a year. But in 1888, her father became ill, and a year after she joined the novitiate, in 1894, her father died. Now, it was at this time that she read much about John of the Cross, and she says about John of the Cross, "Oh, what insights I have gained from the works of our Holy Father, Saint John of the Cross. I had found such great spiritual nourishment." Strangely, she never mentions Therese of Avila, at least not in my reading. If there's somebody who thinks that she did take on and gained much from Thérèse of Avila, who really is the foundress of the Discalced Carmelites, I'd be interested to know. But from my reading of her autobiography, I hear nothing about Thérèse of Avila, which really surprises me, that she actually did read John of the Cross and found insights in them, but not Thérèse of Avila. In the convent, by the way, this was a time of a tremendous amount of spiritual dryness and also tremendous amount of scruples. She struggled with that all her life. It is during this time that she also comes upon her little way, what we know as the little way, but this little way develops out of a tremendous amount of struggle. And I'm going to come to that in about 2 minutes, especially when I talk about what is it that we can learn from Therese, and what is it that we're going to focus in the next 5 weeks or so. The little way becomes the foundation of her spirituality, but Therese herself did not write too much about the little way. In fact, she uses the little way only 3 times in her entire writing. It's her sisters who then took this little way and made it into a spiritual way for people, as a way of growing in their spiritual life. But she herself does not talk too much about the phrase, the little way of spiritual childhood. That is not something that Therese herself used. Many people think that Therese used the little way to describe herself. No, it actually developed later, mainly because of her sisters. Pauline surely was instrumental in all of that. Now, I'm not talking too much about the Little Way now because I've dedicated an entire week to the Little Way. Now, coming to her final years, remember she was in the convent only for 9 years. And her final years were marked by a steady decline in her health. But she was misdiagnosed. She was treated by 2 doctors, and the first doctor completely ruled out tuberculosis. And they found no cause for how ill she was. But then later, that is what she died of. One Lent, 1896, the Lent of 1896, she went to bed on Good Friday, on the eve of Good Friday. And she says she felt a joyous sensation. She says, how sweet this memory really is. I scarcely laid my head upon the pillow when I felt something like a bubbling steam mounting to my lips. I didn't know what it was. Next morning, when she checked her handkerchief, she realized that it was blood. And this is when they really understood the seriousness of her illness, but it was way too late. But Therese found great joy in that suffering. She suffered intensely, and as she was suffering, she was writing her autobiography. In fact, at one point where the autobiography stops, the pen just slips out of her hands. She was in that much pain. Meanwhile, she had the desire to go on a mission to French Indochina, which is now we call Vietnam, I think. But because of her illness, she could not travel. Her doctor at the end would say, if only you knew what this young nun was suffering. But nobody quite understood how deeply she was, because she went about life as it was normal. She just embraced suffering in a way that very few people can. And because of that, she was also kind of misunderstood. Even the end of her life, there was so ups and downs. It would almost think that she would die, and then she would bounce back up. And then she would really go to the brink of death and then again bounce back. This happened 3 times before she actually passed away. So she died on 30th of September, 1897. She was only 24 years old. On her deathbed, she is reported to have said, I have reached the point of not being able to suffer anymore, because all suffering is sweet to me. Her last words were, my God, I love you. She was beatified on October 1897. Now remember that she has been canonized, of course. She was canonized on May the 17th, 1925 by Pope Pius XI, only 28 years after her death. Her parents were also canonized, and in fact they were canonized by Pope Francis. Folks, so that's the story of her life. Now, perhaps it was a little lengthy, but I wanted to share the kind of person that she was, because from now on, we want to build on what we know about her. But let me end with 5 points over here. I'm going to take about 5-6 minutes to do that. By the way, I'm trying to keep these sessions to an hour. John of the Cross kind of went a little longer, but I'm going to keep this to an hour. What to expect from this series? What am I concluding from her life thus far? And what is it that we can expect? In other words, what can we take from today's sharing that we can use for our own selves? So here's my first point. See, many of us feel very inadequate when it comes to our spiritual life. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes or sometimes we fail, or sometimes we lose interest. So many of us feel so inadequate when it comes to our spiritual life. And yet I believe that all of us are sincere. We all want to grow. Am I correct? Now, Therese shows that Each person can create their own path. Remember, she was in a congregation that had spiritual giants. John of the Cross, Therese of Avila, and there are many others. But she, who felt so inadequate in her spirituality, creates her own path. And I think this is something that we need to take to heart. Spirituality does not have to be complicated. Therese teaches us not to be intimidated by great saints and mystics, bound by methods and systems, discouraged by expectations and results. And that's the problem sometimes that we have in spirituality, that we set up expectations that are too high, that we get tied down by methods. We have, with John of the Cross too, right? He takes us beyond methods. There is a freedom in not being stuck. Some people, for them it's the examen, it's the spiritual exercises, it's Lectio Divina. Both for John of the Cross and for Therese, there are no methods. They created their own path. There was a relationship that was spontaneous. Think about it this way. Each child, like if you're a parent, and if you have 2 or 3 children, each child has their own way of being child with those parents. There is no method to be a child. There are no expectations we have, of what a child would do. A child is simply a child who relates with confidence and trust in their parent. Period. Simple. No method. Therese belonged to the Carmelites, who gave the world some of the greatest mystics, and yet, there comes a young woman who creates one of the most creative ways to imagine life, God, herself, her relationship with others, and how all these things interact. She loved nature, she loved people, she loved God, she loved everything. And she loved them in a way that was all interconnected. What does it tell us about our spiritual inadequacy? Don't let it bother you. That's what it says. We can relate to God in the most spontaneous way as a child relates to his or her parents. Or a completely creative path that is neither John of the Cross, that's neither Therese of Avila, that's neither Thérèse of Lisieux. The second point I want to share with you today is how many of us feel little and unimportant and lost. I have my own experience with all of this, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's a good experience. I'll share my own little story. Before Pope Francis became Pope Francis, there were many things that I was preaching which were never heard by a lot of folks. And then along comes Pope Francis, and when Pope Francis came and began to talk, I heard myself. I said, oh my gosh, this guy is talking what I believe in. And I was all excited about it, but here's what I experienced. When I said, it was nothing. But when Pope Francis says, man, it's news all over the world. And it has been my experience that you need to learn to be content with where you are. In other words, I'm not called to be Pope Francis. That's not my calling. What's my calling? My calling is to be who I am. However unimportant, however small, however insignificant, in God's eyes, nobody is insignificant. And Teresa teaches us that. She was the youngest child, someone who was treated like a child. She never stepped out of the cloister, never assumed any position of power or authority. She was a victim of scruples, sometimes ill-treated, physically ill, suffered on multiple levels, never preached a sermon, wrote her memoirs only in obedience, and yet she became a doctor of the church and a saint. Many of us often wonder about the meaning and the significance of our life. Sometimes we feel so insignificant, so small, so little. And Therese teaches us that no life is insignificant, and there is greatness in littleness. Now you know why I decided to do Thérèse of Lisieux because there's contrast with John of the Cross. Not that John of the Cross was longing for greatness, but her way is the simple way, the little way. She also teaches us to be creative with spiritual life. Sometimes we say, I need to pray like so-and-so. I want to be like so-and-so. Therese wanted to be like nobody but herself. So in Therese, I see, now this is my own analysis, I see an interplay between longing for the highest, yet being content with reality. So she aimed for the stars, but she's content with being on the ground. You know what she wrote? She wrote, I bet you that if any nun said this today, she would be in so much trouble. But this is what she said. I feel in my vocation to be a priest. Not that she was wanting to be a priest, but she says, in my vocation, I feel like I want to be a priest. And she says it's in humility that she accepts that she cannot be a priest. But she says, I feel in my vocation of a priest, with what love, O Jesus, I would carry you in my hands, when at my voice you would come down from heaven, and with what love I would give you to the souls. Right? So she's aiming for the stars, but she knows she can't be there. She's on the ground. And what I'm saying is there is this tension between what she aims for and where she finds herself. And this tension is the place where her spiritual creativity comes to fruition. This tension between longing for the highest. She wants to be a priest, a prophet, a preacher, a missioner, a martyr. She's none of that. She's just this little insignificant nun in a convent. This place of tension, as I call between the two, becomes the cause of her discovery of her vocation as love, the little way. She says, my vocation is love. I have dedicated my life to that. So I have an entire session on that, and so we'll talk more about that later. But I want you to, if you feel insignificant, if you feel small, if you feel lost, then this woman is the woman for us. Fourthly, she truly teaches us what it means to be childlike. In fact, she took the name Thérèse of Child Jesus for that reason. She took the name because she had a great devotion for the infant Jesus, but then it just wasn't a name. She goes on to develop and live a spirituality that has as its foundation childlike simplicity and trust in God's love. And we will learn about that in the coming weeks. So it's not only about feeling little and unimportant or lost, but Therese teaches us in all of this to be childlike. So she's not just giving into fatalism, right? In other words, this is what life gave me. No, that's not what this is about. She develops a relationship with Christ, with God, which is childlike, and it is based on the infant Jesus. Remember her instance where she was in the presence of Pope Leo XIII, and how at the age of 14 she insisted on him giving her permission to join the convent, and she wouldn't leave his presence. That's the kind of childlike confidence that she had with God. Her style of prayer, again, very childlike. One time, the family was about to visit the convent to visit Pauline. And the morning that she was about to visit, she was wondering about her own name that she would take when she joined the convent. And she writes, the morning of the day I was to visit, I was thinking things over in my bed, for it was there that I made my profound meditations, and contrary to the bride in the canticles. In other words, the bride in the canticles of John of the Cross, she goes out, right, looking for the bride. Therese says, none of that. I find my love when I'm in bed. So she would pray in bed. This is so contrary to what I imagine, a nun's life would be like. But that's her childlike simplicity that she developed from the time that she was a little child all the way up to the end. Okay, the last point for today. Therese teaches us to let love conquer the soul. And again, this resonates with John of the Cross. The most popular way of thinking of Therese is to think of the love of a little child. We can all relate to that, right? John of the Cross thought of Christ as the bridegroom, the lover, in the Canticle of Canticles. He was the bride, and God is the bridegroom. Now, I must point out that Therese had a very similar imagery. For example, at her first communion, she says, "Ah, how sweet that first kiss of Jesus. It was a kiss of love. I felt that I was loved, and I said, I love you and give myself to you forever." And this is, she's not meaning this in a bad romantic sense, but there is romanticism here. The first kiss of Jesus. It was a kiss of love. She imagines herself as the bride of Christ. On the eve of her profession, she wrote to Sister Marie, "Tomorrow I shall be the bride of Jesus, whose face was hidden and whom no man knew. What a union and what a future." That's John of the Cross, right? So she does not describe her relationship with God primarily in the language of the bride and the groom. Her language is that of a child. But both with John of the Cross and with Thérèse of Lisieux, they allowed their soul to be conquered by love. And I think this is something that we should remember for Lent. This is something we should remember as we struggle in our spirituality. At some point, it's really about allowing our soul. John of the Cross teaches us to connect with the soul. That we can allow our soul to be conquered by love. That is really the way of Thérèse of Child Jesus. She has folks much to teach us about prayer. I have designed an entire session on prayer with Thérèse of Lisieux. And I have also prepared a session on suffering. Suffering with grace, as she would say. So that's it for this evening. This is meant to be an introductory session. I wanted to introduce to you the series. I wanted to introduce to you the person of Thérèse of Lisieux. And I wanted to at least point out to you 5 things that we can take from our understanding and study of Therese. Now I'm going to send you notes of the 5 points that I have shared with. I have some edits to do over here, and by Tuesday or Wednesday, expect an email with these 5 points, and you may use that for your reflection. So that's it for this evening. I think it's still about an hour and 10 minutes. That's me. When I say an hour, it stretches a little bit, but I didn't want to not give you some very important information. So I hope you have a great weekend, and God bless you. Good night.